All right, welcome everyone to our discussion of question 2, which will appear on the Massachusetts ballot, or has, for those of you who've already voted, has already appeared on the Massachusetts ballot in 2020. Question 2 involves what's called ranked choice voting, which is a method which I'm sure our distinguished speakers will explain far more thoroughly than I can, of allowing people to list their candidates of choice in terms of preference. And if no candidate at the end of the first tally of votes has received 50% or more of the vote, then the candidate at the bottom is dropped, and that candidate's second choice votes are allocated to candidates above the now discarded candidate on the ballot. And this process continues. There are some wrinkles, batch elimination. I'm not going to get into that. But basically the idea is that until someone ultimately accumulates 50%, you keep eliminating candidates from the bottom until you ultimately declare a winner. And I will leave it to our distinguished speakers to explain the pros and cons. So let me just say very little bit about our speakers. In favor of ranked choice voting is Professor Peter Enrich, who served many, many years on the Northeastern faculty, taught contracts, state and local tax, wrote about the Commerce Clause, a famous article arguing against states buying corporate headquarters through the state subsidies. And he was a strong advocate for students and had a very illustrious and successful career, and picked just the right time to leave full-time teaching before full-time teaching became a Zoom endeavor. And he will argue in favor. And Jeff Jacoby, a prize-winning columnist for the, who also is a graduate of, I think it's Boston College Law School. Is that right? Or Boston University?
Boston University.
Don't remember. Jeff, you can, but yeah. And so he's a lawyer in addition to a columnist. And he wrote a column in the Globe about ranked choice voting, which many of you might choose to locate. And we're delighted to have both of them here. The format will be that Professor Enrich will speak for 12 minutes in favor. Mr. Jacoby will speak for 12 minutes against. Then we'll give them each 3-4 minutes of rebuttal, and then we'll open to questions. I will moderate the questions. You can either raise your hand. I think I can follow the raise hand function, or you can type in the chat RTS, standing for request to speak. And so now, without further ado, Peter, you're up.
So first of all, I just want to say how glad I am to be back sort of with you folks. Wish it could be more real. I miss you all a lot. It's great to see some familiar faces and some unfamiliar ones as well. And it really is nice to have an opportunity to reconnect at least a little bit with the law school. Hope that there will be many more opportunities in the future. So I guess the place to start is, if in all of our elections there were just 2 candidates running against one another, then the prevalent system, what's often called the first past the post system, the system where whoever gets more votes than anybody else is the one who wins, would be a perfectly fine system. But actually, a world in which there were always only 2 candidates for each open position would not be the healthiest situation for a functioning democracy. It's important that there be space for alternative views to be represented, for multiple candidates to be in the race, for voters to have the opportunity to choose among a wider range of candidates than just 2. And in elections where there are more than 2 candidates, the first past the post system poses some really serious problems. And let me just sort of talk briefly about 2 particularly recurrent and serious problems in those situations. The first is the situation where you have two candidates who are clearly the two primary candidates. It's going to be one of them who is going to end up winning, but a lot of people are unhappy with either of them and want a third choice. And that third choice may be somebody who's further to the left than either of the two main candidates. It could be somebody who's further to the right. But where there's a reason for a third voice to be in. But then voters face a real problem, because if they vote for the minor party candidate, the candidate who's very, very unlikely to win, then they are essentially throwing their vote away and risking letting the candidate who they like least end up being elected because they are siphoning off their votes. Now, ranked choice voting will not apply in presidential elections, but the classic example here is the Bush v. Gore election, where Ralph Nader siphoned off a lot of votes, and where a lot of people who would have preferred to vote for Nader chose not to because they were afraid that they'd be helping Bush win. That's a situation that doesn't serve anyone very well. It makes it hard for the third party candidate to run an effective campaign in which they can show the real depth of support that they may have, probably not majority support, but significant support, but they can't show it all because too many voters are scared to vote for them. And it puts voters in a terrible position where they're having to choose between voting their true preference or ensuring that the second choice, who they feel is far, far better than the third choice, can win. So first past the post works really badly in that situation, and it's a very common situation. Second situation is one that's been exemplified twice in the last couple of cycles in Massachusetts, when there have been open congressional seats, and in each case, there's been a very large field of candidates running for that seat. And in each case, the candidate who ultimately won in the first past the post system only had a very small fraction of the total vote. I mean, in the recent race to fill Joe Kennedy's seat, I believe that Auchincloss won with about 25% of the total vote. And in that case, I think it was pretty clear to most observers that he won because he was the rare moderate in a field that was filled with progressives, and the progressives divided the much larger share of the vote. And we ended up, the district ended up with a candidate who didn't really reflect the views of the district, because the people with more progressive views were fragmented. And again, this is not about what's going to serve progressives, what's going to serve conservatives. It's about what's going to actually let a district elect the person who best represents them. And in a field that has lots of people who are close to where the ideological center of the district is, and one person who's an outlier from where the district ideologically is, the first past the post system is often going to elect that person who's the outlier, which is really not a very effective way of representing what the voters really want, what the district's preferences really are. So those are two very common problems with the first past the post system. And the question is there a better alternative that will avoid those flaws? And there are lots of different ways of designing voting systems. Lots of law professors come up with lots of interesting and ingenious approaches, but many of them are really complicated and messy and call on voters to do complex calculations of what other voters are going to do and of their interests. But ranked choice voting is a very simple, straightforward way of addressing those concerns. And Professor Paul gave a good initial description of it. The basic idea is, if there are more than two candidates for a race, when you vote, you get to identify not just your first choice, but your second choice, your third choice. If there are 10 candidates, you can rank all 10. You don't have to, you can just vote for your first choice if you'd prefer to. But you have the option of ranking your preferences among as many of the candidates as you choose to rank. If one of the candidates gets a majority of the first place votes in that election, they win. End of story. Very simple. What if no one does? What if in the first scenario you have one candidate who gets 46% and the other who gets 47%, and those other 7 or 8% or whatever it is are going to the third party and fourth party and fifth party candidates? Then what happens is the candidate who got the least votes, the least first place votes, is eliminated, and anyone who had that person as their first choice, their vote now shifts to their second choice. And then we see if anyone has a majority. If there's still no one with a majority, then you do it again, tossing out the lowest person and reallocating their votes to the next choice of the people who voted for that person, until you come up with someone who has a majority of the votes being cast, and that person is elected. So by ranking your choices on the ballot, we only need one ballot, and very simply, you can determine who the candidate is who actually has the support among the viable options of a majority of the voters in the relevant district. So I hope you can see how that's going to solve both of the problems I described beforehand. If I had chosen to vote for Ralph Nader as my first choice and for Al Gore as my second choice, I wouldn't be throwing away my vote, because if neither Bush nor Gore got 50% of first choices, then Nader's votes would be shifted to the people's second choices. I suspect predominantly they would have been for Gore, and that would have, if that had pushed Gore ahead, then he would have won. So I'm now free to express my preference. People like Nader are free to run and show what kind of level of support they actually can draw without people having to make those difficult strategic choices. And we still end up at the end of the day with the candidate who can command a majority support of the voters. Likewise, in the multi-candidate congressional primary kinds of situations, if we have a district that is majority progressive, or let's do it the other way around. I don't want to try and paint this as a pro-progressive approach, where the majority of voters in the district support a conservative candidate, but there are 6 conservative candidates and only 1 progressive. Since that progressive is not going to be the second or third or fourth choice of many of the people who vote for the conservatives, eventually enough candidates will be knocked out and enough of their votes will be shifted to people's second or third choices that one of the conservatives, the one who has actually been able to draw the broadest support, is going to be the one who is elected. So again, there is open space for multiple candidates to run. They don't have to worry about competing with one another. And at the end of the day, voters can get their preferences fully stated in ways that are going to be recognized and ultimately reflected in who is elected. So I think this is a pretty simple system. It's one that works very well in the places that it has been applied. People who have, in those communities that have ranked choice voting, have been very satisfied with it, have found it quite comprehensible, quite easy to manage. And it really serves the purposes of voters. It lets voters fully express their preferences in ways that are going to be fully recognized by the public. It's going to be more effective for candidates. It's going to open space for candidates to run and really get their popularity, the popularity of their ideas fully recognized. And it's going to be more effective for democracy as a whole. It ensures that in multi-candidate races, each of the candidates will seek to have a broad appeal so if they can't be people's first choices, they can be their second choices or their third choices, because that's effective. It will reduce divisiveness in campaigns, and it will advance the possibility of multiple voices being heard. So I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
12 minutes exactly. Okay, Jeff Jacoby, you're up.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul, Professor Enrich. Great to be having this exchange with you. And thanks to all of you who have tuned in, and especially to those of you who are showing your faces so I know whom I'm talking to. This debate that we're having about ranked choice voting isn't really a debate about a policy. It's a debate about a process. This isn't a controversy about which people should be elected. It's a controversy over what the rules should be for electing people. Now, public policy can often be quite complicated and often unavoidably so. The last time that Professor Enrich and I were together, we were debating a different ballot issue that was 2 years ago. It was the proposed millionaires' income surtax. And while we came down on opposite sides of that issue, we would both agree, I think the tax law, in fact, any of you who has taken a course in tax law would agree the tax laws are complex and it's hard to come up with any kind of tax code, often any provision in a tax code that doesn't have 1,000 moving parts. And a debate about taxes inevitably gets you down into the weeds about how those taxes would affect the economy or people's businesses or government revenues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Policy can be very complex. But one thing Professor Enrich and I both knew about that ballot issue, which actually ended up not going on the ballot because it was thrown off by the court, but the night that we debated, what we both knew is that whichever side got the most votes would win. Policy itself can be convoluted and complex, but the rules for deciding on a policy, meaning the rules for taking a vote, should be simple and clear and unconfusing. Professor Enrich says that ranked choice voting is very simple and straightforward. I think it's a very bad idea because it's not at all simple or straightforward, and it can be very confusing, which is why I'm voting no on question 2. Most votes wins. That's a simple rule that everyone can understand. One person, one vote. That's also a simple rule that everyone can understand. That's the system we have now. But under question 2, under ranked choice voting, easy to understand goes out the window. You get a ballot with multiple candidates running for an office. Instead of voting for just the candidate you want, you have the option of ranking candidates: first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice. When the voting is over at the end of election day, all the first choice ballots are counted up. The first choice votes are counted up. And as Professor Edwards says, if nobody got over 50%, then the candidate who got the lowest number of first choice votes is eliminated. And all the people who voted for that candidate are deemed in a second round of counting to have voted not for him, not for the candidate they really voted for, but for their second choice candidate. And when that round of tallying is done, if there's still no one who got over 50%, we go through it again. The next lowest scoring candidate gets dropped out. The ballots are counted yet again, and everyone who voted for that candidate is deemed to have voted for their second choice. And if their second choice candidate has already been eliminated, their third choice candidate gets counted. And in this way, the tallying takes place over and over and over, as many times as necessary, until one candidate is finally considered to have had enough votes added to his tally or to her tally to finally go over 50%. Simple and clear? Yeah, right. And that's not the worst of it. Suppose you're voting in an election in which multiple candidates are running for an office, and there's really only one candidate that you like. You really don't want either of the other two, not even as a second choice or third choice, or maybe you just don't know anything about the other candidates. So you vote for the one candidate that you want. Supporters of question 2 always say, you heard Professor Edwards say it a moment ago, they always say that you don't have to rank candidates under ranked choice. You always have the option of just voting for one candidate. What they don't say is that if a tally goes into the second round and you didn't rank a candidate as your second choice, you're out of the game. You don't get a second bite of that apple. You don't get a third bite of the apple. You don't get a fourth bite of the apple. Your ballot would be, to use the term that the experts use when they talk about this, exhausted. You would be exhausted after just one round. And when a winner is finally declared, because a majority has been concocted by all these multiple rounds of tallying, your vote won't be part of that majority because you won't have counted at all. There have been studies that have been done by experts in election law. Researchers have studied what happens in jurisdictions that use ranked choice voting. And what they find is that often it's the case that so many ballots get exhausted, quote unquote, exhausted before the final tally, that the ultimate winner still ends up with votes from less than a majority of everyone who showed up to vote. That's not fair. It's certainly not more fair. It's not a better system than the one that we have now, but it is a much, much more complicated system. I live in the 4th Congressional District. So as Professor Edwards mentioned, in the Democratic primary in my district last month, there were 14 candidates on the ballot. Now, say you live in the 4th Congressional District and you wanted to vote in the Democratic primary, which I did. Even if you wanted to rank 14 candidates, who could do so intelligently? You would have to take a week off just to study all the candidates and their positions in order to come up with some kind of vague idea about which one you like 8th and which one you like 9th best and which one is only your 13th choice and which one you would put 3rd. On a multiple choice test, you can guess and maybe get the right answer. But in a multiple, so to speak, a multiple choice election, in a ranked choice election, if you're just guessing, if you're just putting in numbers at random, that defeats the whole purpose. Most votes wins. One person, one vote. Those should be the rules for running an election. Those are the rules for running an election. Those are the rules that we have right now. Now, granted, sometimes in an election with 3 or more candidates, the top vote getter may not have a majority. Then in that case, there's a simple solution. Not this whole convoluted question 2 ranked choice mechanism, but simply hold a runoff election between the top 2 vote getters. A runoff election in which everybody can vote, regardless of who they voted for in the first round, and without having to rank anybody for anything. Runoff elections are clear and simple. Everyone can understand how they work. They don't exhaust anyone's ballot. Best of all, runoff elections guarantee that the winner actually has a genuine mandate from a majority of voters who show up at the polling place. And in a democracy, that should be really important. This is not a left-wing or a right-wing issue. Democrats like Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom, the former and current governor of California, are against ranked choice voting. They have it in some cities in California. Bill Weld and Bernie Sanders here on the East Coast are, quirky former Republican governor and the socialist senator from Vermont are for it. The Democratic mayor of Haverhill just tweeted the other day that he voted no on question 2. I often vote for Libertarian Party candidates, and I know a lot of Libertarian Party officials who are supporting ranked choice voting. In New York, a couple of years ago, there was a ballot issue about ranked choice voting. And in that election, the NAACP and the Black, Latino, Asian caucus on the city council came out against ranked choice voting. There are people on both sides of this issue, and there's no easy ideological split. It's not about conservatives versus liberals, or whites versus non-whites, or blue versus red. It's about clarity in our election rules. It's about having a process that really is simple and straightforward and transparent, a system that everyone can understand, that doesn't require multiple countings and recountings of ballots, all of which gets done, by the way, by a computer system and computer programs that the public never actually gets to examine. It's about whether we want an electoral system that encourages people to vote, encourages the elderly, encourages immigrants, encourages first-time voters, encourages people who haven't been blessed with a sophisticated education, encourages people on the electoral margins, or whether we want a system that is hard to explain and hard to navigate, even if you go to Northeastern University Law School, never mind if voting isn't really something that you're terribly familiar with in the first place. And one last point. Supporters of ranked choice voting like to say, Professor Endred said it a moment ago, that it will lead to increased civility and courtesy in political campaigns. With all due respect, making elections more complicated will not make them kinder and gentler. We truly have problems these days in this country with the way we treat each other. Too many Americans are at each other's throats. A lot of politics now is not about who you like the most, but about who you hate the most. I wish that all the nastiness and the bitterness of contemporary politics could really be cured by the way we count ballots. I also wish we could all win the lottery and that chocolate didn't have any calories and that coronavirus would disappear tomorrow. But this is the real world. And in the real world, ranked choice voting is not going to make us nicer. It's not going to make our politics nicer. We have to work on that ourselves. So bottom line, 3 really simple rules. Most votes wins. 1 person, 1 vote. If necessary, hold a runoff. Those should be the rules for our elections. No democratic system is perfect, including the one that we have now, but I would argue that ranked choice voting would make things not better, but worse, which is why I'm voting no on question 2.
Okay, so the issue has now been joined. Peter, 3 to 4 minutes response.
Sure. Let me just respond on a couple of points, and Jeff raised quite a few, and I hope that we'll have time in the discussion for people to come back to ones that they're interested in. But first, just a word on why isn't a simple runoff a better alternative? Short answer is, first of all, when there are multiple candidates, taking the top 2 can be no more effective than first past the post. There have been elections where the top 2 candidates have between them gotten substantially less than a majority of the votes, and they end up being the only 2 candidates in the field. Sometimes they are both from the same ideological perspective, even again, if the majority of overall voters in the district had a different perspective. Second, and Jeff, I'm a little surprised that you're not concerned about this, but it's a very expensive approach to have a whole second election. And it turns out that it's not really a way to get the majority view. There are many more exhausted voters who don't vote in a second runoff. In most places where there are runoffs, the turnout drops by something on the order of 1/3 in the runoff election. So not a good solution, better than the present system, but not at all a good solution. Second, just a little bit about the complexity issue. It's hard for people like us who are immersed in thinking about this kind of stuff to really judge what is and what isn't complex. But there's been a lot of polling done of people who have voted in ranked choice voting systems. So in Maine, after their first experience, 90% of Maine voters reported their experience was either excellent or good. In Minneapolis, which has been using ranked choice voting since 2009, a recent survey showed 92% of respondents said they find voting with ranked choice voting, quote, simple. So voters don't find this difficult. Voters use it effectively. They adapt to it pretty quickly. And the counting system, yes, it does involve a computer, but it's a pretty simple computer, and it's fully examinable by people who want to make sure it's working properly. The ballots are all, at least in Massachusetts, they're all paper ballots. They can be audited just like in any other election. There's nothing terribly complex or problematic here, nor does it raise any questions about one person, one vote. Each person's vote only counts once in each round, and courts have recognized that over and over again. Lastly, just a word on the civility point, and this one is a guess, and we don't really know, but what we have seen in some of the jurisdictions that have used ranked choice voting is candidates do recognize that they need to appeal to voters who are supporting other candidates, and that does change behavior. Attack, attack, attack isn't the way you're going to win in a multi-candidate field where there's ranked choice voting. It may be exactly the way to win in a multi-candidate field with first past the post. How well will that work? We'll have to see, but there's at least a real reason to think that it should change candidate behavior in constructive ways. So look forward to continuing the conversation. I'll stop there.
Well,
Can I
just
interrupt?
let me offer a few thoughts. When I don't know if when I was a kid, my siblings and I loved to play Monopoly, and we would often, do they still have Monopoly? Monopoly's still a game, right? And we would sometimes invent our own house rules. We would say that you could only put up a hotel on a property that, you know, before you could turn the houses into a hotel, you could only do it in alphabetical order. We would just make up our own rules, and we would all have to abide by those rules to make the game more interesting. To have weird and complicated rules when you're playing a game can be more fun. You know, if you're a poker player, you can decide with the other players that sevens are the high card and not aces or not kings, in order to change things up a little bit. I would argue that in a democracy, when you want the public to take part in choosing public officials and in voting on ballot issues, simplicity should be a top priority. It should be an urgent value for us to make the rules of elections as simple and clear and straightforward as possible. You know, law school professors and newspaper journalists and law students can certainly have a really interesting conversation about setting up rules that involve multiple tabulating of ballots and second choice and third choice and fourth choice, and how candidates will be dropped off and their voters will be reallocated. We can have a whole interesting conversation about that and what it might lead to. But for the public at large, simplicity and clarity should be a top value so that people understand what's going on when they vote and it doesn't become a crapshoot. Under a ranked choice system, when you go to vote, you have no idea who you're actually going to end up casting your vote for that will make a difference. You don't know who the final choice will come down to. And most of the time it will come down to, if there were 3 candidates, it will come down to 2 of them. If there were 5 candidates, it will usually come down to 2 of them. And you don't know when you go to vote in a ranked choice system who those final 2 candidates are going to be. That's not a good system. Professor Enrich mentioned before the Ralph Nader phenomenon in Florida. We've been hearing a lot about this for the past 20 years. Ralph Nader got something like 50,000 votes. And you know, Florida was decided that year by fewer than 600 votes. And the feeling is Ralph Nader's small number of votes were enough to sway the election. It's kind of a bogus argument, because what really swayed the argument in Florida, what really swayed the vote in Florida that year, was that something like 300,000 registered Democrats crossed over and voted for George W. Bush in that election. It wasn't something that a third party or a minor candidate or an independent candidate caused to happen. It was a decision that was made by a huge number of the voters in that state. Consider a scenario to take up this issue of one candidate splitting the vote of other candidates who are different. So Professor Enrich has talked about one progressive running in a field where there's a lot of moderates or a lot of conservatives, or vice versa. We've been hearing a lot these past months about racial justice in this country. So consider an election in which there are 4 candidates running for office. 3 of them are white, 1 of them is non-white. And the non-white candidate really gets out and mobilizes her voters. She really organizes. And even though a majority of the voters in that district or in that venue, whatever it is, are white, the minority candidate does a really bang-up job of getting her vote to the polls, getting her supporters organized. And when the votes are tallied up at the end of the day, she's got, let's say, 33% of the vote, and the rest of the vote is split among the other 3 candidates. And her 33% is the plurality. That's the top number. Under our current election system, she wins the election. Now, is that unfair because a majority of the other candidates were white or a majority of the voters were white? Or do we want to have a system in which candidates who in one way or another represent a minority, whether it's a racial minority, an ideological minority, maybe even a party minority, are motivated to go out and try to assemble and amass and energize their voters so that they will be the first past the post, even if they don't actually get a majority? I would argue that that's a better system. That's the kind of system that gives voters a genuine reason to support a candidate. It may be that if you favor third party or independent candidates, and I mentioned I often vote for libertarian candidates, maybe you will be disinclined to vote for a third party candidate if you think that that's going to be your one and only chance to weigh in on the issue. I understand that argument, but I would say too bad. We ought to have a system in which you vote for the candidate that you like the best. And if more people agree with you than with any of the other voters, your candidate is the one that wins. One last thing. Yesterday's Boston Globe, front page. I'm just going to read you a little bit. The headline says, "Billionaires bankroll bid on vote choice." And it begins by talking about a couple in Houston, Texas, John and Laura Arnold. And the story says that they are among a network of wealthy out-of-state donors helping fuel ranked choice voting ballot initiatives in Massachusetts and beyond by seeding local communities with millions of dollars. The Arnolds, that's this couple in Houston, have committed nearly $3.4 million in support of question 2. Catherine Murdoch, the daughter-in-law of Rupert Murdoch, has personally given $2.5 million since early September. In all, of the $9.8 million raised by the Yes on 2 committee, just 19 donors account for $9 million of those dollars. Donors outside the state make up 84% of the cash that the proponents of ranked choice voting have raised. And that's just the beginning of the story. It goes on and on and on, and nowhere does it ever explain what their motivation is, why all these millionaires and billionaires from out of state are pouring huge amounts of money into Massachusetts to try to get voters here to agree to change the rules by which we elect people here. I don't fault anybody who wants to spend their money on political change, whatever that political change may be, and wherever that political change may be. But it's worth keeping in mind when you vote on question 2, if you haven't voted already, that most of what you've been hearing or seeing in the course of this debate is being fueled, at least on the Yes on 2 side, by tons of money coming in from out of state. I would be interested to know what it is about the way Massachusetts chooses its political officials that is so interesting to billionaires in Houston that they're pouring all this money into Massachusetts.
So we're now open for comments and questions. Students have first preference.
I have a question.
Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
So I was wondering what your thoughts are on something kind of somewhat similar but pretty different that Florida has on the ballot this year. So for the primaries, we can only vote like for our party, like I could only vote for the Democratic Party or just the Republican Party of who will be in the elections. But on the ballot was changing it so that in the primaries, you could vote on any person that is running. And then those top 2 people, whether they're Republicans, Independents, Democrats, will be on the final ballot. So even if because they're like Florida is a swing state, if the top 2 people who got the most votes were both Republicans, then they would both be Republicans going into the main elections. I'm just kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are about that and compared with the Massachusetts.
Are they identified by party on the ballot in Florida?
Yes, I believe so.
Because a lot of states and a lot of municipalities have what are called nonpartisan elections, and it's always the top, it doesn't matter what the party is. So in municipal elections in Massachusetts, we see that all the time. The candidates that are running are, in a Boston mayoral race, for example, are almost always all Democrats. And in the final election, it will be Democrat versus Democrat who will appear on the ballot.
That's also the system. I mean, California uses a system very much like the one that's on the Florida ballot. And it has resulted in a number of recent cases in post-primary, both candidates in the general election are from the same party. This is really a version of the runoff election approach that Jeff was suggesting was a better alternative than ranked choice voting. In my view, I don't have stress. I haven't thought as hard about that one as I've thought about ranked choice voting. But I am inclined to think that there are real virtues, at least at state and national policy making levels, of having parties that have some fairly substantial distinctions in what they stand for, and having each of them put forward their best candidate and running the one against another. But I think the dynamics of it are complicated, but I do think you have to worry a little bit that in that system, you can often end up with the two candidates in the final runoff being ones who are relatively close to one another in their views and not really giving a full voice to what may be the actual majority of voters who, because they divided their votes too widely in the primary, end up without a candidate who represents their views. Ranked choice voting is certainly a better system than that, but that one, I think there are some virtues and some vices to that approach.
We've had, Sarah, we've had two-party politics in this country going back to the early 1800s. In fact, one of the bitterest campaigns in American presidential politics was the campaign of 1800, when it was the Federalists and John Adams versus what were then called the Democrat Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. And ever since, we've pretty much had a two-party system. And I don't think there's any likelihood that we're going to get away from that anytime soon. I used to be a pretty strong defender of two-party politics because I think it adds, or I used to argue that it added stability to our elections. And I think to a large extent, that's still the case. But the more I have found myself wanting to vote for independent candidates or for third-party candidates or minor party candidates, and the more aware I've become of how the rules are rigged to keep third-party and minor party candidates from even having a fair crack at the ballot, the more dubious I become about the virtues of a two-party system. Whatever the system is, there will always be pros and cons. You can always spin out scenarios in which it will, be unfair to people who want this kind of outcome or that kind of candidate. But I would say even in a system like the one you're describing in Florida or like they have in California, simplicity and clarity are really important virtues. And I think any voting system, like ranked choice voting, that requires you to take 15 minutes just to explain the basic rules, and that is bound to confuse people and leave a lot of people thinking that they did it wrong or that they're just not going to get involved because it raises too many questions in their mind, is a move in the wrong direction. No system is perfect, but better to have an imperfect, clear system than an imperfect, complicated system.
Okay, so Professor Hanjupad has questions for each of you, but before I read them out loud, are there other students who would like to interject first? George, how about you?
Yeah, thank you so much. This might be a silly question, but I think the only thing that's more contentious than finding an elected leader is deciding what to watch on Netflix. If you're in a room with 10 people and you're trying to figure out what to watch, you could either pick 2 movies and vote on one, and half the room's not going to like the movie they're watching. I think there is something to be said about having a ranking system, and at least everyone can see in a ranked order what was the most popular movie to watch. And I think another argument is you don't have to research all 13 movies. There's probably only going to be 3 contenders. You're probably going to have an educated, informed decision on the first 5. I also don't know how much of an effect is the outcome between the two systems. It seems it's like a better system to have like a ranked order. I wonder if each of you could speak to that.
Well, to take your example, right? I mean, if you have a room full of 10 people, first of all, I would suggest they have a conversation and might work it out better that way. But leaving that aside, if you just have them vote and do first past the post, the likelihood of satisfying the majority of the people in the room is pretty slim. If everyone gets to rank their choices, the likelihood you'll end up with something that a majority prefer to any of the alternatives that were available. They may not be thrilled by it, but it'll be something that a majority have said, I'd rather have this than the other things that remained plausible choices because they had significant support from others. So I think that's a good situation to think through, and that will make clear why ranked choice voting is good. It's also pretty simple. You could do that sitting around the room. And, if you write the handbook on how to oppose a ballot question, any ballot question, the key strategy is make it sound incredibly complicated and focus on the glitchy little details. That's the playbook for defeating ballot questions. And the opponents of question 2 are playing that to a T. There's nothing complicated here. You simply express your actual preferences for as many of the candidates as you have a preference for. You just mark a little circle. You mark a 1 circle next to the candidate who's your first choice, the number 2 circle for your second choice, a 3 for your third choice. And then the system works in a very straightforward way to find the first candidate who assembles a true majority of those who are voting. There's nothing complicated here. It's made easier by having computers that can do it, but it's a pretty simple way of making sure that somebody doesn't get elected if they don't have support of a majority of those who are voting. So,
Okay. So Jeff, I'm sure you're going to want to weigh in on that, but as you do, we have another question from Jennifer Reel, who notes you mentioned your occasional, perhaps more than occasional votes for libertarian candidates. And she wants to know if you think that ranked choice voting would actually encourage people to break out of the two-party system, because in the current two-party system, if there's a third party, people worry that they're wasting their votes. And so this ranked choice would be a fallback for them. So that would encourage more multiple candidate fields.
Jennifer, that's an argument that gets made a lot. As far as I know, so far, there's been no data that shows that actually does lead to more third-party candidates being voted for, let alone getting elected. And in George's analogy, that would be like saying that if you happen to have a quirky taste for Burmese art films from the 1970s, and you're the only person in the room who has that quirky taste, you'll be more likely to vote for the Burmese art film. I don't know if Netflix shows such things. If you know that you can also have a second choice vote, I don't know I don't even know what's in the theaters these days. I haven't been to one in so many movies, in so many months. It's a charming analogy. And we all know that in law, analogy and reasoning by analogy is really important. But as with all analogies, there are ways in which it falls short. The most important one of which is that in an election, a candidate who loses, a candidate who gets dropped off because he or she got the fewest number of votes, is out of the election. That's it. You can't go back next week and vote for that candidate. In the Netflix example, if you can't convince enough people in the room to watch the movie that you want to watch, you haven't lost anything in the long term. You haven't lost anything in the medium term. At most, you've lost something in the very short term because you don't get to watch tonight the movie that you wanted to watch tonight. You might have to wait a few hours to watch it or wait until tomorrow to watch it. And related to that is how much greater the stakes are. You can have a complicated system for deciding how to watch a movie, and in the end, all that's at stake is watching a movie. In an election, changing the rules and adding this whole ranked choice system ends up affecting something very substantive, something that can be really consequential. who will be making public policy for the next 2 or 4 years, who will go to Congress, who will be elected governor. I would suggest that that's something where it's a lot more important to have rules that people understand going into the system. And while it may be the case that people will genuinely sometimes have a second choice that they would be almost as happy with, maybe even a third choice that they would be almost as happy with, I don't think it happens very often. For my part, when I go to vote, usually it's the case that I can barely find one candidate that I like. And if there does happen to be a candidate on the ballot that I like, there for sure is not going to be a second one. Maybe that's because, I'm a libertarian conservative in Massachusetts and I'm used to candidates that I vote for losing. But I think that for most people, most of the time, they don't have second and third and fourth choices. They have a candidate that they want to see win. That's the candidate that they should support. And those candidates should do what they can to mobilize their voters so that they'll turn out and give them the greatest number of votes.
So I'm going to say a few words about Jennifer's question, because I do think it's one of the important features that ranked choice voting serves. And at least the way I think about this, I think of the long term of challenges to the dominant two parties. And whether it's coming from the left or from the right, that there can be a serious race. And that's not to say
my dog.
that the libertarian. Yeah, that's not to say that the libertarian or the Green Party candidate is going to win, but we'll at least be able to find out how much real support they have. And probably it's going to be substantially more than is going to show up under the first past the post system, because people are going to feel that they safely can express their first preference without jeopardizing their second preference.
Can I jump in, Peter? I want to ask you directly.
Let me finish, Jeff.
I just want to challenge you on the point that you're making. Why is that better than a system in which you encourage candidates to go out and mobilize supporters?
This is a way of encouraging candidates to mobilize support, but it's allowing candidates who this year aren't likely to win and who have to take time to build a base over a number of election cycles to run, be taken seriously, to have the other candidates, the more mainstream candidates, have to appeal to their voters as well, because those voters' second choices are going to be highly relevant. But one of the very important things is it means that the libertarian or the Green is able to show, gee, that candidate was able to draw 15%, 20% support. That sends very important messages throughout the whole political system and is going to shift the positioning of the major parties, is going to open up the possibilities for alternative parties to emerge, something that has happened repeatedly in American history, but that is worth facilitating. And it does it in a way that respects the ability of voters to express their real choices, a real choice that says, I really would like the libertarian candidate, but if I can't have the libertarian candidate, I'll settle for Governor Baker or whoever the next best choice is. I think, Jeff, maybe you're unusual. I think most people are capable of recognizing preferences among more than one candidate and want to express those. And that's certainly the experience that's been shown in the communities and the places that have ranked choice voting.
Okay, we're getting near the end of our time. So I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give each of you a little time. But as we wrap up, I'm going to give you in advance some of the concerns that are in the chat that have not yet been addressed. Jeff, maybe you'll wrap up first. So Margaret Hunt DuPont is interested in the question of, wouldn't runoff elections be an additional burden for low income and other marginalized communities to have to get out and vote a second time, given that it's hard to get leave from work and things of that nature. Jennifer Reel mentions that many of our people now are voting for someone a Democrat, Republican, even though they don't like them, because they think that those are the only two people who have a chance to win. And then Heather Panico was interested in which of these two approaches, one past the post or a ranked choice voting, is better for incumbents. And then Peter, I'll give you yours after Jeff is done.
Okay, let's see if I can remember some of those. First of all, to take the last one first. I think any system ends up being the best for incumbents because incumbents always find a way to rig the rules or adjust the regulations in order to make it easier for them to stay in power and to make it more difficult for challengers to emerge. So whatever we end up with, incumbents are going to find a way to play it so that it's to their advantage. Are runoff elections an expense? Yes. I am a fiscal conservative, and there's a long list of government expenses I would happily eliminate, some of which I'm sure would horrify everyone on this Zoom chat. But on my long list of things that I'm perfectly happy for the government to stop spending money on, elections would be way down near the bottom. I think elections are one of the core functions of government, and running elections are one of the core functions of government. And if we're going to spend money on anything, let's spend money on having elections. And if that means that it costs a few million more dollars to put on a runoff election in order to have a chance to choose a winner for an office that everyone had a chance to vote for, and in which it will be seen that the winner got a majority of the votes that were cast, then I think that that's a good thing. On this, I forgot what the second one was, and I'm not looking at the.
Well, impact on not the costs to the government, but if you're a voter who has trouble.
Right, so marginalized voters. So understood. I mean, I've said several times that any system you come up with will always have, there'll always be flaws, and there will always be faults, and there will always be imperfections in any system. Yes, I can understand. There might be some people for whom turning out to vote a second time is going to be a disincentive. I would point out that in many municipal elections in Massachusetts, city elections, we actually have a runoff system, but we just do it in reverse. We have the first, what we call the preliminary election, and then there's the final election. And the final election will be the two top vote getters in the preliminary election. That's what we do in city council races. It's what we do in mayoral races. So it's already a system that voters are very familiar with. Voter turnout is something that a lot of people are concerned about. And I think that there are certainly things that we can do to increase people's interest in voting, their motivation to vote. But saying that giving them a chance to choose who the final winner will be is going to be a turnoff, a disincentive to vote, that doesn't seem very convincing to me. Certainly not when you compare it to question to ranked choice, which, contrary to what Peter said, most ballot issue debates are not about complexity. This one, I think, should be and is about complexity because, as I said at the very beginning, we're debating process. And we're debating process in the most important activity that we engage in as a society in our democracy, namely electing people and voting for ballot issues. And in that core democratic function, I think simplicity and clarity are absolutely important. And to have to switch to a new system whose rules are so complicated that many people will never understand it is not a move in the right direction. That's a move in the direction of pushing people out of the system altogether because they just won't be able to follow what's going on.
Okay, Peter, it's you have the final word. Things that have been raised in addition. Are you creeped out by all the money that's coming in from outside, including from Murdoch's, to support ranked choice voting? Are you worried about people gaming the system and if there's 10 candidates?
So let me start. First of all,
likely to rival the ones that they care about all the way down at the bottom as number 10. And then a last question is the goal of encouraging third party, fourth party candidates has always seemed to me to be a good one. But in recent times, I've been watching the Maine Senate debates. I don't know if you've watched any of those. And the existence of a truly, bizarre individual on the stage has made it very difficult for Gideon and Senator Collins to actually have a coherent discussion about the issues. And Maine has ranked choice voting. And so the encouragement of all these fringe candidates, I'm beginning to worry about that a little bit. So maybe you could talk about those things in addition to your wrap up.
A lot of things to touch on. I want to start by just both thanking Jeff and thanking all of you who are watching and participating and asking good questions. And again, it's nice to be back in touch with all of you. And I need to digress on one point about the last topic that Jeff and I debated, the fair share amendment or the millionaire's tax. Just wanted to clarify, in all likelihood, it's gonna be on the ballot. It's just taking a little longer than we'd expected. It's gonna, in all likelihood, be back in 2022. Maybe we can have another debate about that then. So am I freaked out by the billionaires throwing money into this? I'm very, Jeff says he's fine with people spending money on pursuing their interests. I'm not so fine about people spending money to pursue their interests in elections. I think it's a huge problem. I think it's something we're going to have to fix sooner or later. But I must say, I'm a lot more troubled when rich people throw their money into electing a candidate or into passing a ballot initiative that's about a substantive matter that's going to affect them. Here, they're throwing money at devising a system that doesn't systematically advantage or disadvantage anyone. I don't know who these individuals are. As far as I can tell, they are people who are jumping onto a campaign that I was involved in long before people were spending money. Lots of other people at the grassroots were involved in. They're jumping into it and seeing it as something that is pro-democratic, and that's great. I think even billionaires can sometimes be pro-democratic, I guess. But no, it doesn't trouble me particularly. It strikes me as a side issue. The gaming of the system, and this is a much longer conversation than we're going to have tonight, but if you really think it through carefully, you're going to find that the situations in which gaming would really accomplish something, when the ultimate test is you keep going until somebody gets a majority of the votes in one round, the opportunities for gaming are very, very, very slim. So the reality is the sensible thing to do, the strategic thing to do in a ranked choice voting system is rank the candidates in accordance with your preference. That's going to be the best way to pursue your strategic interest under almost any kind of game theoretic analysis. Should we be worried about attracting flaky fringe candidates? I mean, the first thing to be obviously said is we seem to have more than enough of those under the existing systems right now. But the reality is that one of the beauties of ranked choice voting is, at least in terms of parties, it's going to provide very good signaling about whether a party is speaking to voters in an effective way or not, much more effectively than the first past the post system does. And so over a course of time, I think that ranked choice voting is going to serve well to identify where there's a party or a position that has serious but less than majority support and encourage its growth and development. I don't think over time it's going to be particularly encouraging of truly marginal, fringy candidates. But again, hard to predict how things like that are going to play out. And again, the present system hasn't done terribly well at weeding those folks out anyhow. So I hope people are seeing that if coming back to sort of the basic goals of having a system that really lets a wide range of views be in play in elections and lets voters really express their preferences in ways that still ensure that ultimately the person who will be elected is the person who can represent the majority of the voters in the election. That's a pretty desirable system, and it's what ranked choice voting does. So I hope people who haven't yet voted will vote yes.
That was terrific from both of you. I'm so grateful to both of you for participating, and we certainly got terrific views, pro and con.
Thank you.
I hope we'll have a chance to do it again. I want to also thank all of our attendees for coming. I think that made the event much more fun. And I wish you all a very pleasant night and look forward to doing something like this again in the future.
Thanks
So
so
take
much,
care,
Paul.
everybody.
Thank you
Thank you
all.
for being here. Good night.
Take care, Jeff.